Hello friends, for today's video we're back with another new fantasy releases wrap-up, and the 3 books we'll be discussing today would be Compendium of Lost Tales, Greenteeth, and Blood over Brighthaven. As always, I'll have timestamps in the description bar down below in case you'd like to skip ahead to any one specific book or reference back to these at a future date, then those are there for your convenience. Also, I have already done an in-depth non-spoiler review for Blood over Brighthaven, so I'm actually going to start with this one. That way if you've already watched that, you don't feel like hearing me gush about it again, then you are of course welcome to utilize the timestamps. And if you are somebody who would prefer to watch that more in-depth review, I'll have that video linked as well. Jumping into it, as stated, we'll kick things off with Blood over Brighthaven. This is by the same author that wrote Sword of Kaigen, which is somewhat of a booktube darling at this point. It's not necessarily mainstream, but there are a lot of people within fantasy circles that have discussed that story and hyped it up and reviewed it. A lot of people were really shocked by some of the decisions the author made within that story and how they really aren't afraid to take chances and portray certain complex topics that I would say typically take other authors much more of a page count to establish and do well. This author has a way of doing it where it does feel like there's depth, but also it packs a punch in a very short amount of time, which isn't to say that this is necessarily a short book, but it is a standalone. And where Sword of Kaigen did that fantastically, specifically with propaganda and how that trickles down into people's everyday lives and impacts familial relationships. Within this story, it's not just propaganda, but it's more just the way in which societies can benefit off of the backs of other individuals. And it is so tied to every single part of their society. It's actually kind of an integral part of their society. And there's so many aspects of this story that are very easy to extrapolate and apply to everyday life, which is why I think this book is taking so many people by storm, is because you read it and you are very frustrated by a lot of what transpires within it, but in a way where you can very easily see those same things or those same sentiments expressed and shown in our own lives. The setup for the story is that you follow this young woman named Sayana, who has a lot that she has to try and overcome. She lives within a society that very much feels like there are certain roles people are meant to play. And for her, the way in which that affects her has to do with her gender. By being a woman, despite the fact that she is incredibly bright and intelligent, they don't really see her as fit to have her academic prowess fully realized. However, they do allow for women to test into their academies periodically and try to basically become almost like high mages. And she has studied her whole life for this. She is now prepared to try and go on this academic endeavor. But despite the fact that you are having a character that I think typically when you hear characters have to overcome these sorts of odds and you feel like they're the underdog as a result, this character is exceptionally unlikable. There are times throughout the story where they are, well, there's a couple different things that transpire with this character. Sometimes they are so cutthroat and they are so passionate, you could say, that it is somewhat entertaining, somewhat in the sense that a Glockta character who is doing despicable things, but you kind of find them amusing at times. So there are moments like that. There are other moments, however, where this character is just exceptionally naive, to a point, though, of causing harm to other people. And because they value so much the ability to think through what is logical, they do actually challenge their own beliefs once enough evidence is presented to them. However, as the reader, it can be exceptionally frustrating because you see that there's clearly a flawed system and the character, having grown up in it, is not really aware of it. And oftentimes they're blinded by their own issues that they have to try to overcome, and thus they don't really recognize the things that are negatively impacting other people that they are actually benefiting from. So there's a lot of complexities just within this character, but also within their society as well, as our main character is somebody who lives within this place. So there's this city that's not necessarily futuristic, but it is, I would say, more futuristic than what you typically find within a fantasy setting. It's borderline steampunk, I would say. And outside of the city, where there is this magical barrier, outside of that barrier, people are randomly impacted by something known as the Blight, which can harm them, it can harm wildlife. Even if human beings manage to not have this affect them, which there's really nothing they can do because it's so random. But even if they manage to survive, so much of the plant and animal life is being affected that it's literally stripping the land bare and making it hard to live in general. So people that come in from the outside and then come into this city, they have faced enormous odds and they have really faced some hardships and seen some terrible things. However, they are not necessarily treated the same way as people that were born in the city and grew up in this city. And oftentimes they are viewed as individuals who should just be grateful for the opportunity to live within this protected city, as opposed to seeing them as valuable because all human beings are valuable. And Sayana, having grown up in a more academic setting, while yes, you can see that there are hurdles that she has to try to overcome, she also has certain privileges having been born in this city and also associating with and being relatively a part of more of the upper classes. So she really doesn't see the hardships that other individuals have to face. And where she is forced to see this is through another character who ends up being somebody that works alongside her. These two characters butt heads, they challenge each other, and it's where a lot of the very fabrics that make up their entire society really start to unravel. I thought it was incredible. I loved it. It is definitely a new favorite fantasy standalone for me. I thought that the pacing was fantastic. The characterization was fantastic. The willingness to show the ugliest sides of not just societies and institutions, but human beings as well. I thought all of that was done very, very well. And as I said, you could easily take so many of the things from this and apply it to our own world, which is what I think this author has accomplished twice now, which is an incredible feat. I can't wait to see what they do next because Blood Over Brighthaven and Sword of Kaigen both are absolutely fantastic books, in my opinion, at least. Next up, we have Compendium of Lost Tales. This is the third book in the Emily Wilde series, and as a result of it being the third book, of course, I can't say too much about the specifics for the plot with this third story, but I can give you kind of an overall view of the trilogy as a whole now. The setup initially, when you start the first book, is you follow a young woman named Emily who is somebody studying the Fae, and it is somewhat of a historical fiction feeling type of world where they have an actual academy and they have various different universities and degrees where people are able to study and become very proficient in all the knowledge to do with the Fae. However, there is so much knowledge still that is left up in the air that people don't know about that is a mystery. And Emily Wilde is somebody who absolutely craves knowledge. She loves research. She does not love having to interact with other people, however, and sometimes that makes it so that she has a harder time finding out things that she needs to learn, as oftentimes studying the Fae in their world revolves around actually going out and doing what you could categorized as field research and interacting with local people within rural areas that are very heavily impacted by the Fae, trying to figure out what parts of the stories they're telling, what parts of folklore are truth and what are fiction. However, because she has this little blind spot, or a spot she's aware of that she just doesn't really know how to get through, she ends up having one of her co-workers accompany her on one of her expeditions, we'll say. And this individual is a complete opposite from her. They are a little bit on the slacking side when it comes to their work ethic. However, they're fantastic at socializing with people. They're very charismatic, they're charming, and they're a little bit flippant at times. And these two, while they butt heads, they also work really well together as they tend to kind of fill the gaps with each other's shortcomings. And in the first story, you go to this very rural, almost, I would say, northern feeling, kind of Nordic feeling setting, and you are exploring some of the winter Fae. And then throughout the course of the trilogy, you are following the characters as they go to other places and explore the Fae there. And what I was talking about with the way that they have to kind of discern fact from fiction with the locals and their stories, I would say something that made this third book a little bit different from the first two is how stories inform the Fae, which was something that I hadn't really seen done quite to the extent that this series did, or if I've really even seen it done at all. So the idea, and you see this sometimes in other Fae stories, where the Fae can't necessarily create art, and so they're really fascinated by creations that maybe human beings would take for granted or wouldn't think that much of, but they see it as fascinating because they can't necessarily create art themselves. Something like An Enchantment of Ravens really depicts that quite well. And you do find that they are fascinated by really random things. They also have a tendency, if you're really following fae that feel more like forces of nature or things that just kind of do things on a whim, you do also explore their lack of humanity at times just for the sake of entertainment because they live such long lives and they get bored. So what this author did that I thought was interesting was that they took the idea of stories essentially being a playbook for what would happen. It was like a blueprint for how the plot would unfold. And in the third book, there is, you could almost argue, like an antagonistic force. There's almost this predetermined fate that is going to occur that our character, Emily, has discovered through her research, and she doesn't want this predetermined fate to occur, so she's trying to figure out what ways can I look into the stories and find an out, and how can I reverse this predetermined fate, which I thought was really kind of interesting. It was sort of a meta take on stories, and it felt like story inception in a sense, because in order for her to figure out how she was going to circumnavigate the problem, she would have to read stories and then recall those stories so that she could try to figure out how to affect their own story, her own story. And I just thought that that was all really quite interesting. I will say I think the first book in the trilogy is my favorite, as I just really enjoyed more of the interactions between Emily and the people that she was trying to learn from, which isn't to say that I think the fae themselves aren't written well, but I almost really liked when the fae were, I would say, maybe equally explored to character interactions and other human beings, which there was still that present within the second and third books, certainly, but I just feel like the first book had such a great balance, and I didn't get that same balance within the second and third books. I would say the third book is the heaviest on the fae elements, so if you like that aspect of the story, which I was looking forward to it, certainly, but I would say that the third book has that the most. Also, last thing I'll state about this, there is a dog in this story, and the conclusion for the dog's arc was beautiful, and I thought it was so sweet. And I gotta say, there's a character that their way of expressing their love to another character was to do something nice for the dog, and I was like, stop. I was quite choked up about the dog. The dog's the best. The dog's always the best in every story. Last for today, we have Greenteeth. Really quick, if you don't know and are interested in an alternative to Audible, there's an audiobook service called Libro FM. This isn't sponsored or anything. I just really like Libro FM because they can have a competitive price up against Audible, so the rate for their subscription is basically the same. However, if you are any kind of a reviewer, they have something that you can apply for called an influencer program at the beginning of every single month. They have a huge selection of new audiobooks that you can download for free, and you can get up to 10 downloads every single month. The reason I bring this up is because this one actually was one of the selections for the download, and I thought the narrator was great also. So for those of you that are audiobook fans and reviewers, definitely maybe give Libro FM a try. They also have a lot of the profit go to indie bookstores, which I think is incredible. And you can actually set up, similar to something like bookshop.org, which indie bookstores you would like to support. If you have no idea which one, my indie bookstore is great, changing hands, but you don't have to select that one. You are, of course, welcome to select any. But then also, thank you to the publisher, because this physical copy was sent to me by Orbit. So a huge thank you to Orbit. Orbit's always great with reviewers, and in general, I just think that they do a lot for their authors. So all that said, actually getting to the book itself, regardless of whether I had been sent a physical ARC, regardless of whether it had been a download from Libro FM, I was going to check this out because I thought it sounded fantastic. And also, I am a fan of T. Kingfisher, and that was one of the comp titles, was T. Kingfisher's works. And so I absolutely had my interest piqued just from hearing that and reading the synopsis. And then when I read it, I was so pleasantly surprised that not only did it meet my expectations, because I was actually nervous I was going to be too hard on it and I would constantly be comparing it to T. Kingfisher, but I actually was very impressed with the way it took some familiar things that we've seen in fantasy stories before, especially when it comes to fairy tale type stories and fae, but it did something that I think a lot of stories could do if they really want to sort of freshen up and make the story feel different and have it stand out, which is what the focus was when it came to the thematic elements and the characters. So, for example, there was a huge emphasis on friendship in this story, which was so nice. There's no real romantic plotline. You could almost argue, the barest of Z plots, I'll call it, where there's like one character that kind of maybe has some care for another. And I do not mind there being romantic plotlines in stories, but I do think that we kind of expect it at this point, and sometimes it feels like they're shoehorned in to meet some kind of criteria, or it feels like maybe the author didn't want it, but they were encouraged to put it in, or it feels like something that's marketed as fantasy is actually fantasy romance, and of course there's nothing wrong with fantasy romance. Readers just want to know what they're getting into. But because relationships of all kinds are worth exploring, I think a lot of us do crave the other kinds of relationships besides the romantic ones, because those are definitely having their day in the sun, I would say, as of late. And I think we're kind of starting to miss a little bit some of the just friendship dynamics that a lot of us do crave in our stories. And this did it so well. I really enjoyed the friendship elements. I am going to kind of compare this in a sense to what we typically expect and want from romantic relationships and stories, because I think that with how prevalent it is, we have collectively as readers sort of discerned what is a trend and what is tropey and what feels like this is actually this done well, and we're able to dissect a lot of things. But I think sometimes people can just say, oh, there's a friendship element in the story, and we don't actually get into the specifics of that and what makes up a good friendship in a story. And I wanted to touch on those things. So in romantic stories, I think oftentimes what is something that is an indication of a romantic relationship done well is when you see the characters interact with each other, you see them challenge each other, you see them uplift each other, you see them be different individuals who are unique and have their own personalities, and those personalities sometimes really are able to shine because of the encouragement maybe from the other character. Other times you are going to see the characters maybe not necessarily get along, because inevitably every human being is going to have moments where sometimes somebody else gets on their nerves, and you will sometimes even see characters argue, and then you see how do they come through those arguments. So all of these things I think are true of friendships and stories as well. You see the characters. I don't have to repeat all the things I just said, but all those things you can apply to friendships. And this story did it so well. The setup is that you have this being known as Jenny, and Jenny lives within this body of water that she refuses to think of as a swamp. She takes very good care of it, and she has a lot of pride in this. Jennies in general are always called Jennies, so this particular Jenny happens to take care of this particular body of water. And one day a woman is thrown into this little lake, we'll call it. Very quickly, Jenny figures out that this woman is a witch, and that she is somebody who was thrown in against her will with the intention for her to drown. And typically, Jenny doesn't really get involved with the affairs of humans, but she also is like, well, it's my job to take care of this body of water, and I just don't really want to have to deal with a dead body at the bottom of this lake. So let me take her to this little underwater cave I have and kind of bring her back to health, and then figure out what happened and then send her on her way. Through helping this young woman, Jenny discovers what led to this witch being thrown into the lake, which is this very tragic tale of this individual who came into this town, convinced everybody that there was evil running rampant, and if they had any signs of who was the evil person in this village, that they out them. The villagers eventually turned on this character, and then that is what resulted in this character being thrown into the lake. So Jenny hears all this and thinks that's terrible. The woman is breaking down because she has a husband and she has children who love her very dearly, and she wants to get back to them. She wants to help them. She has no idea how she's going to possibly get back out there and go see them again when everybody just threw her into a lake. Jenny decides, you know what, I'm going to help you. I'm going to try to help you get back to your husband and your children. And something that I thought was really different as well, but beyond just the friendship components to the story, is the fact that you actually actually have a parent character. It sounds like her and her husband are really in love, and it sounds like they both care so deeply for their children. And so you, as the reader, you're like, hey, what the heck? I want her to get back to her kids and her husband too. So you kind of already have a reason to root for her. And she just seems like a nice person. And when we say witch, it really is just, oh, it was just things I was taught to kind of help heal wounds and like help with farming. And she's just a nice lady. And you're like, no, what the heck? This is wrong. And so you just immediately are kind of indignant on her behalf. And Jenny is too. And that's why Jenny's like, I'm going to help you. And that's kind of takes them on this journey, this quest that they were not expecting to unfold as epically as you even as the reader were expecting. It does get really, really, I would say, very fairy tale-esque with much bigger stakes than just this small little village. As it turns out, the individual who was causing chaos in their village is perhaps, I'll call them an agent of chaos, we'll say. They're maybe not as normal and mundane as meets the eye. Where the friendship components over the course of the story unfold is that you actually do see that Jenny and the witch care about each other. They get to know each other. They get to know about each other's pasts. Both of them are mothers in their own way, and so they bond over that. There's a great line at some point in the story where Jenny says something encouraging to the witch about how this is, you're a hero in a story. And then, I don't know why this is making me emotional, but she says, am I a hero or am I just a mother? Like, she's just doing what any mother who loves her children would do. And I was like, oh, I don't know why. It's just, I'm like, it's so nice to see parents who love their kids in stories. We so rarely have that in fantasy books. It's always some kind of terrible hardships that are a result of these fractured families and these horribly terrible parents, or the parents aren't around at all. You know, there's always those scenarios and you're like, oh, this family loves each other so much. I just want them to be together again. So anyway, you see these characters that are really encouraging to each other. They get to know each other. They really help each other in a lot of ways, but also they have their differences and they argue and they come from very different walks of life, certainly, given that one of them is a witch and the other one is a creature who lives in a lake. So they have their differences, and sometimes that causes them to have friction, certainly. But it was such a lovely tale, and I do think that while I appreciated that the story got a lot bigger than I was expecting, especially given that it's a relatively short novel, I do think it almost got too big at some point. It didn't quite maybe need to get as epic and far-reaching, both in its stakes and also its lore, as maybe it needed to. That's not necessarily, of course, an objective criticism by any means. It's just, for me, I think I liked that it was just a little bit more contained. But I don't think that's going to be an issue for too many other people. I just think that there was a couple of things toward the end and their reveals that I think maybe would have been more satisfying had the book been longer and maybe certain things been set up just a little bit more, but really wasn't something that took away from what I think are the pros of the story, which are the ways that the friendship develops and just in general the characters themselves and their interactions together. This was lovely. Highly recommend. I think a lot of people are going to really quite enjoy this, especially if you are a parent. I mean, this is like a magical Taken, I think, in a lot of ways. So it just kind of, I think, is going to speak to a lot of mothers and fathers out there, and or aunts and uncles who just can't imagine something happening and wanting to help somebody who has children. You know, it was a lovely story, a nice fairy tale, and I think where fairy tales have been done time and time again at this point, that one stood out for the reasons that I already discussed. That's it, though, for some new fantasy releases. As I said before, I will have the in-depth non-spoiler review for Blood Over Brighthaven in case you'd like to hear more about it, as well as just links that are relevant to these in the description bar down below. Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later.